The smell of rosemary and garlic butter filled the air as I balanced the homemade dinner rolls in one hand and knocked on the heavy oak door with the other. October in Massachusetts meant the leaves were turning gold and crimson, and the Henderson family estate looked like something from a magazine cover. The porch stretched wide with carved pillars, and warm light spilled through the tall windows, where I could see silhouettes moving around the dining room. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'd driven 3 hours from my cramped studio apartment in Boston, the one with the radiator that barely worked, and the neighbor who played music until 2 a.m. My Honda Civic looked embarrassingly small next to the Mercedes and BMW parked in the circular driveway, but I'd made it. Another family dinner where I'd smile through the comments and pretend not to notice when conversation shifted to topics I couldn't afford to join. The door opened, and there stood my cousin Marcus, all 6 feet of him in a crisp navy sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His eyes did that quick scan they always did, taking in my thrift store blazer and the fact that I was carrying homemade rolls instead of wine from some vineyard none of us could pronounce. "Vanessa," he said, not quite smiling, "you actually came." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, though we both knew I'd rather be anywhere else. He stepped aside, and I walked into the foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier. The house always felt like a museum to me, all cold surfaces and expensive art that no one was allowed to touch. Growing up, my grandmother had lived here, and it felt warmer then. Now it belonged to my Uncle Richard, Marcus's father, who'd inherited both the house and Grandma's investment portfolio. "Everyone's in the dining room," Marcus said, leading me through the hallway lined with family photos. Most of them featured the successful branches of the family tree. Uncle Richard, cutting ribbons at his law firm's expansion. My cousin Jessica is holding her medical school diploma. Marcus at his Harvard Business School graduation. There were a few pictures of me, but they were from years ago, back when they still thought I might amount to something. The dining room buzzed with conversation and the clink of silverware against expensive china. Uncle Richard sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, gesturing with his wine glass as he told some story about a case he'd won. Aunt Catherine sat to his right, her diamond earrings catching the light from the chandelier above. She'd been a real estate agent before she married money, and she never let anyone forget how far she'd climbed. "Vanessa!" Aunt Catherine's voice carried that particular tone reserved for charity cases and distant relatives. "How lovely that you could make it. We weren't sure you'd have time off from—" She paused, that slight frown appearing between her perfectly shaped eyebrows. "What was it you were doing again?" "I'm still at the marketing firm," I said, setting the rolls on the sideboard next to the other dishes. "Patterson and Associates." "Oh right, the startup." She said it like it was a hobby, not a job. "Are they still operating?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Patterson and Associates wasn't a startup. It was a mid-sized firm that had been around for 15 years, but it wasn't prestigious enough for the Henderson standards. I made decent money there, enough to cover my bills and save a little, but decent wasn't impressive at a table where everyone else pulled in 6 figures. "They're doing well," I said, taking my seat at the far end of the table. The same seat I'd occupied for the past 5 years, right next to my cousin David, who worked in finance and had opinions about everything. "That's wonderful," Aunt Catherine said in that tone people use when they don't actually care about the answer. "David was just telling us about his promotion at Goldman Sachs." "Show her the watch, David." David rolled up his sleeve to reveal a Rolex that probably cost more than my car. "Early bonus," he said with a shrug that was meant to look casual but came across as smug. "The markets have been good to me this year." "Congratulations," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? That I'd been working for 3 years to save up for a decent laptop? That I'd been eating ramen for dinner more nights than I cared to admit? "You know, Vanessa," Uncle Richard said, leaning forward with that look he got when he was about to dispense wisdom, "if you're ever interested in making some real money, I could introduce you to some people. Get you started on something more substantial." The word substantial hit like a slap. As if my job, my life, my choices were all just playing dress-up until I got serious about success. "I appreciate the offer," I said, cutting into the prime rib that had been placed in front of me. "But I'm happy with what I'm doing." "Happy," repeated my cousin Jessica, who'd been quiet up until now. She was a surgeon, engaged to another surgeon, and they were planning a wedding that would cost more than most people's houses. "But are you secure?" The question landed with surgical precision, cutting right to the heart of what they all thought about me. I was the family member who'd chosen passion over profit, who'd stayed in a job I loved instead of chasing the biggest paycheck. I was the one who shopped at Target instead of Nordstrom, who drove a 10-year-old car instead of leasing something new every few years. "I'm secure enough," I said quietly. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Secure enough? That's rich, coming from someone who asked to borrow money for her security deposit last year." The table went silent. Even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to fade. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, remembering that phone call to Uncle Richard when my landlord had raised my rent and I'd been $300 short. I'd paid it back within a month, but apparently that didn't matter. "Marcus," Aunt Catherine said softly, but she was smiling. They were all smiling, that uncomfortable smile people get when someone else's embarrassment becomes the evening's entertainment. "I'm just saying," Marcus continued, emboldened by the attention, "maybe if you'd taken Dad's advice years ago and gone to law school instead of chasing some creative writing dream, you wouldn't be—" "Wouldn't that be what?" I asked, setting down my fork. My voice was steady, but I could feel something cracking inside my chest. "Poor," he said simply. "You wouldn't be poor." The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Poor. As if my worth as a human being could be measured by my bank account balance. As if the life I'd built, the friends I'd made, the work I was proud of, all of it meant nothing because I couldn't afford to eat at the restaurants they frequented. "I'm not poor," I said, though even as I said it I knew how it sounded. Defensive. Weak. "Really?" David chimed in, clearly enjoying himself now. "Because didn't you ask Jessica for help with your student loans last month?" I looked at Jessica, who had the decency to look embarrassed. I'd mentioned in passing that I was struggling with the payments, and she'd offered to help me look into refinancing options. I declined, but apparently she'd shared the conversation with David. "I was just asking for advice," I said. "About money you don't have for loans you can't pay," Marcus said. "That's the definition of poor, Vanessa." Uncle Richard cleared his throat. "Now let's not be harsh. Vanessa's doing her best with what she has. Not everyone can be successful, in the traditional sense." His words were meant to be kind, but they cut deeper than Marcus's insults. The pity in his voice, the way he spoke about me like I wasn't sitting right there, like I was some charity case they all had to tolerate at family gatherings. Taurus. "Some people," Aunt Catherine added, reaching for her wine glass, "are just more comfortable with simpler lives. Simpler. As if my life was simple, because I chose to find meaning in things that didn't have price tags. As if the books I read, the articles I wrote, the volunteer work I did at the animal shelter, all of it was just simple, because it didn't generate profit." "You know what your problem is, Vanessa," Marcus said, warming to his theme. "You're afraid of real success. You hide behind this whole starving artist thing because you're scared to actually try. It's easier to be poor and pretend it's a choice than to risk failing at something that matters." I stared at him across the table, this man who'd never worked a day in his life until his father handed him a position at the law firm, who'd never had to choose between groceries and gas, never had to decline wedding invitations because he couldn't afford the gift, never had to smile and nod while his family dissected his financial situation like a medical condition. "Maybe," I said quietly, "we have different definitions of what matters." "Oh, please," Jessica said, rolling her eyes. "Don't give us the money doesn't buy happiness speech. Money buys security, opportunity, respect." "When's the last time you felt respected, Vanessa?" The question hit like a physical blow. When was the last time I'd felt respected? Not here, certainly. Not at family gatherings where I was treated like the family disappointment, the cautionary tale they told their children about what happens when you don't prioritize financial success. I feel respected every day, I lied. By who? Marcus asked. Your coworkers at the little marketing firm? Your neighbors in your studio apartment? Come on, Vanessa. When's the last time you felt like you belonged somewhere? The room spun slightly. I reached for my water glass, but my hand was shaking. They were right, and that was the worst part. I didn't belong here, in this house with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. I didn't belong at their country club events or their charity galas. I was the family member they invited out of obligation, the one they tolerated because blood was thicker than water, but just barely. I belong to plenty of places, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Really? Aunt Catherine asked, and now she wasn't even pretending to be kind. Because from where I sit, you look like someone who's been pretending to be something she's not for years, playing at being a professional when you're really just struggling. The word struggling felt like a diagnosis. Like they'd all gotten together and decided that was what I was. A struggling person, someone to be pitied and dismissed, and occasionally helped with small loans and career advice. I'm not struggling, I said, though we all knew it was a lie. I'm building something. Building what? Marcus asked. A mountain of debt? A resume full of jobs that don't pay enough? A life so small that you have to borrow money from family members just to keep it running? I looked around the table at their faces, all of them watching me, with that particular expression people get when they're witnessing a car crash. They were enjoying this, I realized. They were enjoying watching me squirm, watching me defend a life they'd already decided was worth less than theirs. You know what I think? David said, leaning back in his chair. I think you're addicted to being poor. I think you like the drama of it, the way it makes you feel special and different. But the truth is, you're just scared. Scared to grow up, scared to make real money, scared to be an adult. I am an adult, I said, though the words felt weak and unconvincing. Adults don't live in studio apartments at 32, Jessica said matter-of-factly. Adults don't ask relatives for money. Adults don't show up to family dinners with homemade rolls because they can't afford to bring wine. The homemade rolls. The thing I'd been proud of. The way I'd gotten up early that morning to make them from scratch. Kneading the dough while listening to music. Thinking about how nice it would be to contribute something personal to the meal. Now they were just another symbol of my poverty, another reminder that I couldn't afford to participate in their world the way they expected. I brought rolls because I wanted to, I said quietly. You brought rolls because you're broke, Marcus said bluntly. Just like you drive that beat-up Honda because you're broke, and you live in that tiny apartment because you're broke, and you work at a job that barely pays your bills because you're too proud to admit you made the wrong choices. The room fell silent again. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, counting down the seconds, until I could reasonably excuse myself and drive back to my beat-up Honda and my tiny apartment and my job that barely paid my bills. I think, Uncle Richard said slowly, that we're all just concerned about you, Vanessa. We want to see you succeed, but you have to want it too. You have to be willing to make the hard choices, to sacrifice the things that are holding you back. What's holding me back? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Your pride, Aunt Catherine said simply. Your stubborn refusal to admit that your way isn't working. Look around this table, Vanessa. Look at what we've all accomplished. Don't you want any of this? I looked around the table at their faces, at their expensive clothes and their confident smiles and their absolute certainty that their way was the only way. I looked at the crystal glasses and the fine china and the oil paintings on the walls, all of it evidence of a life I'd never been able to afford. I want to be happy, I said finally. Happy, Marcus repeated, and there was something cruel in his smile. You keep saying that word. But you don't look happy, Vanessa. You look tired. You look defeated. You look like someone who's been lying to herself for so long that she's forgotten what the truth looks like. And maybe that was the worst part. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been lying to myself, pretending that financial security didn't matter, that I could build a meaningful life on passion and good intentions and homemade dinner rolls. The truth, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, is that I'm doing the best I can. Your best, Jessica said sadly, isn't very good. The words hit like a physical blow. I felt something break inside my chest, something that had been cracking for years finally splitting completely in half. They were right. My best wasn't very good. My best had gotten me a studio apartment and a 10-year-old car and a job that paid just enough to keep me afloat. My best friend had made me the family charity case, the one they pitied and dismissed and occasionally helped with small loans. I stood up from the table, my legs unsteady beneath me. I should go. Vanessa, Uncle Richard said, his voice gentle but firm. Sit down. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help you see that there are other options. Better options. I can see fine, I said, though everything in the room looked blurred around the edges. I can see exactly what you all think of me. We think you're family, Aunt Catherine said. We think you're someone with potential who's been making poor choices. But it's not too late to change course. Change course to what? I asked. To become someone I'm not? To chase money instead of meaning? To measure my worth by my bank account balance? To measure your worth by your ability to take care of yourself, Marcus said. Like the rest of us do. The rest of us. As if I was somehow outside the circle of functional adults. As if I'd been playing with life while they'd been living it for real. I walked toward the door, my purse clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Behind me, I heard chairs scraping against the floor, voices calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to see their faces again, to see the mixture of pity and disappointment and relief that I was finally leaving. The cool October air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I realized I was crying. Not the dramatic, sobbing kind of crying, but the quiet, steady tears of someone who'd finally heard the truth about themselves and didn't like what they'd learned. I got in my Honda Civic and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring back at the house where my family was probably already moving on to dessert, and discussing what a shame it was that I couldn't handle a little honest feedback. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was addicted to being poor. Maybe I was afraid of real success. Maybe I was just too proud to admit that my way wasn't working. But as I drove away from that house with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, something else was stirring inside me. Something that had been quiet for years but was finally beginning to wake up. It wasn't anger, exactly, and it wasn't defiance. It was something quieter and more dangerous. It was the decision to stop caring what they thought. And 3 miles down the road, as I pulled into a gas station to collect myself, my phone buzzed with a notification I'd been waiting 2 years to see. The notification that was about to change everything, that was about to prove that sometimes the family disappointment knows something the rest of them don't. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I was tired of being poor, tired of being pitied, tired of being the cautionary tale they told at family dinners. I was tired of being small in a world that only seemed to value size. And I was about to discover that I'd been anything but small for longer than any of them could imagine. I sat in my car at the gas station, hands trembling as I stared at my phone screen. The notification wasn't from my family, wasn't an apology text or a concerned uncle checking if I'd made it home safely. It was from an app I'd barely thought about in months. Crypto tracker. Portfolio alert. Significant movement detected. My heart was still racing from the dinner, from Marcus calling me poor, from Jessica's surgical precision in cutting down everything I'd built for myself. The word poor kept echoing in my head like a broken record. Poor. Broke. Struggling. Unsuccessful. All the words they'd thrown at me like stones, each one finding its mark. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and tapped the notification. The app loaded slowly on my ancient iPhone, the one with the cracked screen that I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years but never had the extra cash. Even my phone was evidence of my failure, apparently. The loading screen finally gave way to my portfolio dashboard, and I blinked at the numbers, certain there was some kind of glitch. The last time I checked this app, maybe 6 months ago, My total holdings had been worth about $1,200. Not life-changing money, but enough to make me feel like I was participating in something bigger than myself. Now the screen showed a number that didn't make sense. A number with so many digits that I had to count them twice to understand what I was looking at. $47,832,156. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered, then blinked hard and looked again. The number was still there, still impossible, still making my hands shake as I tried to process what I was seeing. $47 million. This has to be wrong, I whispered to my empty car, my voice hoarse from crying. This has to be some kind of mistake. But even as I said it, memories were starting to surface. Memories I'd buried under 3 years of financial stress and family disappointment, and the daily grind of trying to make ends meet on a salary that barely covered rent. 3 years ago, I'd been different. Not successful by Henderson family standards, but different. Curious. Optimistic. I'd read an article about cryptocurrency, about people making fortunes on digital coins that existed only in computers. And something about it had fascinated me. Not the get-rich-quick aspect that everyone seemed to focus on, but the technology itself. The idea that money could exist without banks, without governments, without the traditional gatekeepers who decided who got to participate in wealth. I'd started small. $50 here, $100 there, money I scraped together from freelance writing gigs and the occasional bonus at work. I'd bought Bitcoin when it was cheap, Ethereum when nobody could pronounce it correctly, and then something called Solana that a programmer friend had mentioned in passing. But it was the other one that I'd really believed in. Chainlink. Link. I'd read the white paper, understood what they were trying to build, and something about it had clicked. The way they wanted to connect traditional databases to blockchain technology, to bridge the gap between the old world and the new one. It reminded me of translation work, taking something that existed in one language and making it understandable in another. I bought Link when it was trading for 37 cents. I bought a lot of Link when it was trading for 37 cents. With trembling fingers, I navigated to my individual holdings. Bitcoin was up significantly, showing a value that would have made me rich by any normal standard. Ethereum had performed even better, but it was the Link holdings that made my breath catch in my throat. I owned 847,000 tokens of Chainlink. Tokens I'd accumulated over 18 months of careful, methodical purchases with every spare dollar I could find. At today's price of $58.43 per token, those holdings were worth just over $49 million. Oh my God, I breathed, my voice barely audible over the sound of traffic passing by the gas station. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I sat there in the parking lot, staring at numbers that represented more money than my entire family had probably earned in their lifetimes combined. More money than Uncle Richard's law firm, more than Jessica's surgeon's salary, more than Marcus's trust fund and David's Goldman Sachs bonuses put together. I was rich. Not comfortable, not well off, not even wealthy. I was rich in a way that changed everything, in a way that made their dinner table comments seem not just cruel but absurdly, laughably wrong. But instead of feeling vindicated or triumphant, I felt something else entirely. I felt hollow. For 3 years, I'd watched my crypto investments from a distance, checking the app occasionally but never really paying attention to the gains. I'd been too busy trying to survive, too focused on paying rent and student loans, and trying to prove to my family that I was more than just their poor relation. The crypto had become background noise, something I'd put money into and then forgotten about while I dealt with the daily reality of being exactly what they said I was: broke. And now, sitting in a gas station parking lot with tears drying on my cheeks, I realized that I'd been rich for months. Maybe longer. While they'd been judging me for my studio apartment and my old car and my inability to bring expensive wine to family dinners, I'd been sitting on a fortune that would make their net worth look like pocket change. I'd been rich while Marcus called me poor. The poor day, I'd been rich while Jessica questioned my security. I'd been rich while Uncle Richard offered to introduce me to people who could help me make real money. I'd been rich while Aunt Catherine patronized me about my simpler life. The irony was so complete, so perfect, that I started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind of broken, hysterical laughter that comes when the universe reveals just how cosmic its sense of humor really is. My phone rang, jarring me out of my spiral. For a moment, I thought it might be someone from the family, maybe Uncle Richard calling to apologize, or Marcus texting to make sure I hadn't driven off a bridge. But it was Tom Morrison, my friend from college who worked as a blockchain developer in San Francisco. "Tom?" I answered, my voice still shaky. "Vanessa, holy shit, have you checked your crypto portfolio lately?" I looked at my phone screen, still displaying that impossible number. "I'm looking at it right now. Link is going absolutely insane. It's up 400% in the last week alone. There was some announcement about a partnership with major banks, and everyone's finally understanding what the technology actually does. I've been trying to reach you for days." 400%, I repeated numbly. "Did you ever buy any? I remember you asking me about it a few years ago. Did I buy any?" I'd bought 847,000 tokens of it. I'd spent every spare dollar I had on it for over a year, believing in something that everyone else thought was fake internet money. "I bought some," I said quietly. "How much? Because if you bought even a few $1,000s worth back then, you're looking at serious money now. Like, change your life money." I stared at the dashboard again. $47 million. In 3 years, my forgotten crypto investments had grown from a few $1,000s into more wealth than I'd ever imagined possessing. "Tom," I said carefully, "if someone hypothetically owned, say, a lot of Link tokens from 3 years ago, how would they go about, accessing that money?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Vanessa, please tell me you didn't lose your wallet keys." Wallet keys. I'd written them down, I remembered that much. A long string of random words that served as the password to my digital fortune. Where had I put them? "I have them," I said, though suddenly I wasn't sure. "I think I have them." "Okay, good. Because if you're sitting on what I think you might be sitting on, you need to be very, very careful about how you handle this. We're talking about life-changing money here, Vanessa. Like generational wealth. Generational wealth. The kind of money that would make me not just comfortable but powerful. The kind of money that would shift every dynamic in my family, that would make their judgments not just wrong but irrelevant." "I need to go home," I said suddenly. "I need to find those keys." "Wait, Vanessa, how much Link are we talking about here? Ballpark?" I looked at the screen again. 847,000 tokens. At current prices, that was... I couldn't even think about it without my hands shaking. "A lot," I said finally. "Tom, I think I might be rich." "How rich?" I took a deep breath. "Really, really rich." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, Tom spoke. His voice hushed with something like awe. "Vanessa, please tell me you're being careful about this. Please tell me you're not posting about it on social media or telling people." "I haven't told anyone." And suddenly I realized why. It wasn't just that I'd forgotten about the crypto, or that I'd been too busy to check. It was that some part of me had always known this moment would come, and I'd been protecting it. Protecting the secret that would change everything. "Good. Keep it that way until we can figure out the best way to handle this. Crypto wealth makes you a target, Vanessa. For hackers, for scammers, for people who want to get close to you for the wrong reasons. For family members who'd spent years telling me I was worthless. I thought but didn't say." "I understand. Do you have a financial advisor? A lawyer? Because you're gonna need both." I almost laughed. "A financial advisor?" I'd been clipping coupons to afford groceries. "A lawyer?" I'd been driving a 10-year-old Honda because I couldn't afford car payments. "I'll figure it out," I said. "Vanessa, this is serious. You're about to become one of the wealthiest people in your state. Maybe your region. This changes everything about your life, and not all of those changes are going to be good. People are going to treat you differently. They're going to want things from you. They're going to judge your choices through a completely different lens." They were already judging my choices, I thought. They'd been judging me as a failure for years. Now they'd have to judge me as something else entirely. "I know," I said, though I didn't really know anything. I'd never been rich before. I'd never had to navigate wealth or the complications that came with it. I'd spent my entire adult life learning how to be poor with dignity. Now I'd have to learn something completely different. "Promise me you'll be careful," Tom said. Promise me you'll think before you do anything dramatic. Dramatic. Like driving back to that house with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and telling my family exactly what I thought of their financial advice. Like watching their faces when they realized that the poor relation they'd been pitying for years was worth more than all of them combined. I promise, I lied. After we hung up, I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, just staring at the numbers on my screen. $47 million. It was enough to buy 10 houses like Uncle Richard's. It was enough to make their Mercedes and BMWs look like toy cars. It was enough to change every conversation we'd ever have for the rest of our lives. But more than that, it was enough to prove that everything they'd said about me tonight was wrong. Not just misguided or harsh, but factually, demonstrably incorrect. I wasn't poor, I wasn't struggling, I wasn't unsuccessful or afraid of real money, or addicted to being small. Mingiquer. I was the opposite of everything they thought I was. And tomorrow, I was going to show them exactly how wrong they'd been. I started the car and began the 3-hour drive back to Boston, back to my studio apartment that I could now buy 100 times over, back to my life that had just fundamentally changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I drove through the dark Massachusetts countryside, passing the same exits I'd taken for years on my way to family obligations, I thought about what Tom had said. About being careful, about thinking before doing anything dramatic. But dramatic was exactly what the situation called for. After years of being dismissed and pitied and treated like a cautionary tale, I finally had the power to rewrite the story. To show them that their definition of success was not just narrow but completely irrelevant. Finally had the Ko'oli. The poor cousin was about to become the richest person any of them had ever met. And I was going to make sure they never forgot it. Poor cousin Wava. By the time I reached my studio apartment in Boston, it was past midnight. The building looked different to me now, smaller somehow, like a childhood toy you rediscover as an adult. The narrow hallway with its peeling paint, the elevator that groaned between floors, the neighbors' music still thumping through thin walls. All of it felt temporary in a way it never had before. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, each step echoing in the empty stairwell. My keys jingled as I unlocked the door, and I stepped into the space that had been my entire world for the past 4 years. 400 square feet of carefully arranged furniture, a kitchenette that barely fit a microwave, a Murphy bed that I pulled down every night and folded up every morning. Home. Except now it felt more like a costume I'd been wearing, a role I'd been playing without realizing there was a different script entirely. I dropped my purse on the small table by the door and immediately started searching. The wallet keys, those 12 random words that Tom had asked about, I'd written them down somewhere. I remembered being so careful about it, treating those words like the most important thing I'd ever owned, which I now realized they actually were. My hands were still shaking as I pulled out drawers, rifled through folders, checked behind picture frames. Where would 3 years ago Vanessa have hidden something that important? I tried to think back to that time, to remember the mindset I'd been in when I first started buying cryptocurrency. I'd been hopeful then. Not naive exactly, but optimistic in a way that felt foreign to me now. I'd believed that technology could change things, that there were opportunities out there for people like me if we were smart enough and patient enough to see them coming. I'd read white papers like other people read novels, stayed up late in forums discussing the future of decentralized finance, spent my lunch breaks researching which projects had the most potential. And Chainlink had stood out to me like a beacon, not because of the hype or the marketing, but because of what it actually did. It solved a real problem, connecting the old world of traditional databases to the new world of blockchain technology. I'd understood it in a way that felt intuitive, the same way I understood good writing or effective marketing campaigns. So I bought, and bought, and bought some more. I found the notebook tucked behind my college textbooks on the bookshelf. A small black journal with important stuff, written in my handwriting on the cover. Inside, between grocery lists and work meeting notes, were the 12 words that served as the key to my digital fortune. Morning coffee elephant purple 7 dance window flight umbrella solid network 12. 12 random words that were worth $47 million. I stared at them for a long moment, then carefully copied them into my phone, double-checking each word against what I'd written in the notebook. This was it. This was the key to everything changing. But as I sat there in my studio apartment, looking around at the life I'd built on a marketing coordinator's salary, I realized something that made my stomach twist with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I didn't want to change everything. I liked my life. I liked my job, my coworkers, my quiet neighborhood, my weekend trips to the farmer's market where I knew the vendors by name. What I wanted to change was how other people saw that life, how my family saw me. Posimob. My phone buzzed with a text message, startling me out of my thoughts. It was from Uncle Richard. Posimob. Vanessa, I hope you made it home safely. Catherine and I were talking, and we think maybe we were too direct tonight. Family dinner next Sunday at 2. Please come. We'd like to talk. Too direct. As if the problem had been their delivery, and not their message. As if calling me poor and unsuccessful and afraid had been a communication issue, rather than a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of. I stared at the text for a long moment, then typed back, "I'll be there," but this time I'd be coming with more than homemade dinner rolls. The next morning, I called in sick to work. It wasn't entirely a lie. I felt feverish with possibility, dizzy with the weight of what I'd discovered. Instead of going to the office, I spent the day doing research. Real research, the kind I'd learned to do in journalism school but had never applied to anything as important as this. I researched financial advisors who specialized in cryptocurrency wealth. I researched tax implications of large crypto gains. I researched private banking services and wealth management firms, and all the infrastructure that existed to help people like me, people who had suddenly found themselves with more money than they knew how to handle. But mostly, I researched my family. Mormons. It's amazing what you can find online when you start looking with fresh eyes. Uncle Richard's law firm was successful. Certainly, but not as successful as they made it seem. According to public filings, his annual revenue was in the low 7 figures. Impressive by normal standards, but a fraction of what I was now worth. Marcus worked at the firm, yes, but as a junior associate making a salary that I could now match with the interest on my crypto holdings. Jessica was a surgeon, but still paying off medical school loans that totaled more than most people's mortgages. David's Goldman Sachs position was real, but according to LinkedIn he was an analyst, not a managing director. Successful, but not wealthy. Not yet. Even their houses, their cars, their lifestyle, all of it was financed, leveraged, carefully constructed to look more impressive than the underlying finances actually supported. They weren't poor, but they weren't rich either. They were comfortable, well-off, successful by conventional measures. But I was wealthy. Truly, genuinely, life-changingly wealthy. Jikaskane te. And they had no idea. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. Marcus. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Vanessa, hey. Dad asked me to call you. His voice was different than it had been Sunday night. Less confident, maybe. Or maybe I was just hearing it differently now that I knew what I knew. What can I do for you, Marcus? Look, I think maybe we got a little heated at dinner. You know how family can be. We all care about you, we want to see you succeed. Define success, I said, leaning back in my desk chair at work. I'd decided to come in after all, partly because I needed the normalcy, partly because I wasn't ready to start making the kinds of changes that my new wealth would require. Come on, Vanessa, you know what I mean. Financial stability, career growth, the ability to take care of yourself without having to rely on other people, the ability to take care of myself. I was worth $47 million, and my cousin was lecturing me about taking care of myself. What if I told you, I said carefully, that I'm more financially stable than you think? Are you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're barely keeping your head above water. And that's not a judgment, Vanessa, it's just reality. Reality. Their reality, where success was measured by visible markers of wealth, by job titles and house sizes, and the ability to order expensive wine without checking the price. But there were other kinds of reality, other ways of being successful that they'd never learned to see. Marcus, I said, what would you do if you found out you were wrong about something important, something you'd been certain about for years? I'd apologize and adjust my thinking. Why? Just curious. How's work going? At the firm? It's good. Busy. I'm working on this big merger that could really put me on the map, you know? If I handle it right, I'm looking at a promotion, maybe even making partner eventually. Making partner eventually. He was so proud of the possibility, so focused on the long-term goal of achieving something that I could now buy outright if I wanted to. I could probably buy the entire firm if I set my mind to it. That's great, Marcus. I'm sure you'll do well. Thanks. And Vanessa? I really am sorry about Sunday. We shouldn't have piled on like that. It's just, we worry about you, you know? We want you to have the kind of security that lets you sleep at night. I looked around my small office, at the marketing proposals scattered across my desk, at the photo of my college friends that I kept next to my computer. Security that lets you sleep at night? I'd been sleeping fine, actually. Better than fine. I'd been sleeping the sleep of someone who'd made good choices and was building something meaningful, even if it didn't look impressive from the outside. I sleep fine, Marcus. Do you? Because Jessica was saying that when she offered to help you with your student loans, you seemed pretty stressed about money. Jessica was saying. Of course they'd all been talking about me, analyzing my financial situation like a group project. Poor Vanessa, with her student loans and her old car, and her inability to afford a decent apartment. Poor Vanessa, who needed their help and their pity, and their well-meaning advice about making better choices. I'm handling my student loans, I said, which was true. I'd been making payments on time for years, even when it meant eating ramen for dinner more nights than I cared to admit. Are you handling them, or are you just making minimum payments while the interest builds up? Because there's a difference. There was a difference. And the difference was that I could pay off my student loans tomorrow, with a tiny fraction of my crypto holdings. I could pay off everyone's student loans. I could pay off the student loans of everyone I'd ever met and still have more money than I knew what to do with. I'm managing, I said. Okay, but what if you didn't have to just manage? What if you could actually get ahead? Dad's serious about wanting to help you get into something more lucrative. He has connections at some really good firms, people who could get you started in a career that actually pays well. A career that actually pays well. As if my current career was just a hobby. Just something I did to pass time, until I got serious about making real money. As if the work I did, the campaigns I created, the clients I helped, all of it was somehow less valid, because it didn't generate the kind of income that impressed people at family dinners. What kind of career are we talking about? I asked, genuinely curious now. What did they think would be suitable for someone like me? Finance, maybe. Real estate. Something with commission potential, where you could really build wealth over time. Dad knows people at some of the big investment firms, and they're always looking for smart people who are willing to work hard. Smart people who are willing to work hard. The implication being that I was smart but hadn't been working hard, or that I'd been working hard but not smart about it. Either way, the assumption was that I'd been doing something wrong, choosing something inferior, settling for less than what I was capable of achieving. That's very thoughtful of him, I said, but I like what I do. Liking what you do is a luxury, Vanessa. First you build security, then you can afford to pursue your passions. That's how it works for successful people. Successful people. There was that word again, always used in a way that excluded me, that placed me in some other category of person who hadn't figured out how life was supposed to work. Marcus, I said, what if I told you that I am successful, just not in the way you recognize? What do you mean? I mean, what if success looks different than you think it does? What if there are ways of building wealth and security that don't involve climbing the corporate ladder or impressing people at dinner parties? There was a pause. Vanessa, are you getting involved in some kind of get-rich-quick scheme? Because those things never work out, and you could end up losing what little you have. Get-rich-quick scheme? He was so certain that anything outside their narrow definition of success had to be a scam, a delusion, a mistake waiting to happen. The idea that I might have found a different path, a better path, was literally incomprehensible to him. "No schemes," I said. "Just different approaches." "Okay, but different approaches to what? You're 32 years old, Vanessa. You can't keep experimenting forever. At some point, you have to choose stability over creativity." I am 32 years old. As if I was running out of time. As if I was approaching some deadline for achieving respectability. As if the choices I'd made for the past decade had been a phase one needed to grow out of, rather than a foundation I'd been building on. "What if stability and creativity aren't mutually exclusive?" I asked. "In theory, maybe, but in practice? Look around, Vanessa. Look at the people who have both. They're the ones who built financial security first, then used that security to pursue their interests. They didn't try to do it backwards. Everything I'd done, every choice I'd made, every small success I'd achieved, all of it was backwards in his mind. All of it was evidence that I didn't understand how the world actually worked. "I should probably get back to work," I said. "Of course. But think about what I said, okay? About Dad's offer to help you get into something more substantial? The offer's real, and it could change your life. Change my life." If only he knew how much my life had already changed, how much it was going to change for all of them. "I'll think about it," I promised. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at my computer screen without really seeing it. They were so certain about everything. So confident in their definition of success, their understanding of how wealth worked, their assessment of my choices and my potential. And they were so completely, utterly wrong. The year per. Sunday was 5 days away. 5 days to decide how I wanted to handle this. How I wanted to reveal what they'd missed, what they'd underestimated, what they'd been wrong about for years. 5 days to plan the conversation that would change everything between us forever. I opened my laptop and started making notes. Not about financial advisors or tax implications or wealth management strategies, though I'd need all of those soon enough. Notes about what I wanted to say to my family when I walked back into that dining room. Notes about how it would feel to watch their faces when they realized that the poor cousin they'd been pitying was the richest person they'd ever met. Notes about what happens when the family disappointment becomes the family success story overnight. Wednesday morning, I did something I'd never done before in my 3 years at Patterson & Associates. I scheduled a meeting with my boss, Sarah Chen, and asked for a private lunch to discuss my future with the company. Sarah was one of those people who'd built her career on intuition and authenticity, rising from junior account manager to creative director through sheer competence rather than politics. She'd always treated me fairly, never made me feel small for choosing meaning over money, never questioned my commitment just because I drove an old car or lived in a studio apartment. "Vanessa," she said as we settled into a corner booth at Romano's, the Italian place where we sometimes took clients. "You sounded serious on the phone. Is everything okay?" I looked across the table at this woman who'd been more of a mentor to me than any of my actual family members, who'd seen potential in me when others saw only limitations, and realized that what I was about to tell her would change our relationship forever. "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to keep it completely confidential until I figure out how to handle it properly." Her expression grew concerned. "Are you leaving us? Because if this is about money, we can talk about a raise. I know we're not competing with the big agencies salary-wise, but—" "I'm not leaving," I said quickly. "At least, not yet. But Sarah, I need you to know that my financial situation is different than you might think." She frowned. "Different how?" I pulled out my phone, opened the crypto app, and turned the screen toward her. "Different like this." Sarah stared at the numbers for a long moment, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Then she blinked, looked at me, looked back at the screen, and very carefully set down her cup. "Vanessa, is this real?" "It's real. I've been investing in cryptocurrency for 3 years, and one of my holdings just exploded in value. I'm worth it." I swallowed hard, because saying it out loud still felt impossible. "I'm worth almost $50 million. The restaurant continued buzzing around us. Servers carrying plates, couples discussing weekend plans, business people negotiating deals. Normal life proceeded as if the world hadn't just fundamentally shifted on its axis. 50 million, Sarah repeated slowly, as in 5 with 7 zeros after it. Yes. And you're still coming to work every day, still living in your studio apartment, still. She gestured vaguely at my thrift store blouse and drugstore makeup. Still living like you make $40,000 a year. Because until Sunday night, I didn't know. I mean, I knew I had some crypto investments, but I hadn't checked the values in months. I was too busy actually living my life to pay attention to what was happening in my portfolio. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Sunday night. What happened Sunday night? So I told her. About the family dinner. About being called poor and broke and unsuccessful. About Marcus suggesting I was afraid of real success, and Jessica questioning whether I belonged anywhere. About sitting in that gas station parking lot, humiliated and broken, only to discover that I'd been wealthy the entire time they were tearing me down. Jesus, Sarah breathed when I finished. Your family called you poor while you were sitting on $50 million. They don't know. Nobody knows except you and my friend Tom, who's a blockchain developer. I haven't told anyone else. Why are you telling me? It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with for 3 days. Why was I telling Sarah? Why not my parents or my college friends or someone who'd known me longer? Because you're the person who's seen me build something meaningful, I said finally. You're the one who understood that I was choosing this life on purpose, not settling for it out of fear. And because I respect your judgment about people and situations. And what judgment are you looking for exactly? I took a deep breath. They've invited me to another family dinner this Sunday. They want to talk, which I assume means more lectures about my poor choices and offers to help me get my life together. And I'm thinking about telling them the truth. About the money. About how wrong they've been about me. About how their entire understanding of success and failure is based on assumptions that turned out to be completely incorrect. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, twirling pasta around her fork without eating it. Can I ask you something? What do you want to accomplish by telling them? What do you mean? I mean, what's your goal here? Do you want an apology? Do you want to watch them scramble to revise their opinion of you? Do you want revenge for years of condescension? Or do you actually want to repair these relationships? The question hit me like cold water. What did I want to accomplish? I'd been so focused on the dramatic reveal, on the moment of vindication, that I hadn't really thought about what came after. I want them to see me differently, I said slowly. I want them to understand that their way isn't the only way to be successful. And you think having $50 million will prove that? Doesn't it? Sarah smiled, but it wasn't entirely happy. Vanessa, you know I think you're brilliant, right? You know I've watched you create campaigns that were pure genius, solve problems that stumped people with twice your experience, build relationships with clients that other agencies couldn't touch. I know. And none of that had anything to do with money. You were already successful before you knew about the crypto. You were already valuable, already accomplished, already proving that there are different ways to build a meaningful life. I stared at my plate, suddenly uncertain. But they didn't see it that way. No, they didn't. And the question is, will having money make them see it, or will it just make them treat you differently for the wrong reasons? It was a question I'd been avoiding, buried under the excitement of vindication and the thrill of having a secret weapon. Would telling them about the money actually change their understanding of who I was, or would it just shift me into a different category in their minds? I don't know, I admitted. Here's what I think, Sarah said, leaning forward. I think you have 2 choices. You can tell them about the money and prove that you're successful by their definition, which means accepting their definition as valid. Or you can continue being exactly who you are and let them figure out on their own that their definition is too narrow. But what if they never figure it out? Then that's their loss, not yours. Vanessa, you don't need their validation, you never did, You've been living a successful life for years without their approval. She was right, of course. But there was something else, something I hadn't admitted even to myself. It wasn't just about proving I was successful. It was about proving that they'd been cruel to someone who didn't deserve it, that they'd been wrong in the most spectacular way possible. I think I want them to feel guilty, I said quietly. I think I want them to realize that they've been horrible to someone who was already doing better than all of them combined. Sarah nodded slowly. That's honest. And it's understandable. But guilt doesn't usually lead to better relationships, Vanessa. It leads to resentment and defensiveness, and people trying to justify why they acted the way they did. So what would you do? I'd probably do exactly what you're planning to do, she admitted with a rueful smile. I'd march in there with screenshots and watch their faces when they realized how wrong they'd been, but I'm petty like that sometimes. The question is whether you want to be petty or whether you want to be strategic. Strategic. I'd been thinking about this situation emotionally, reactively, focused on the immediate satisfaction of watching their assumptions crumble. But Sarah was right. I needed to think about the bigger picture. What would the strategy look like? Strategic would be figuring out what kind of relationship you actually want with these people, then working backwards from there. Do you want to be closer to them? Do you want respect without intimacy? Do you want to distance yourself entirely? Because the way you handle this reveal will largely determine which of those outcomes you get. I thought about Uncle Richard with his patronizing offers to help me network into a real career. About Marcus with his certainty that I was afraid of success. About Jessica with her surgical precision in identifying my failures. About Aunt Catherine with her thinly veiled pity disguised as concern. Did I want to be closer to people who'd spent years making me feel small? Did I want their respect if it was only based on my net worth? Did I want to maintain relationships that required me to prove my value, rather than simply recognizing it? I think, I said slowly, I want them to understand that they hurt me. And I want them to understand that they were wrong about me in ways that go beyond money. Those are two different goals, and they might require two different approaches. How so? If you want them to understand they hurt you, you need to tell them about the impact of their words and actions, not about your crypto portfolio. If you want them to understand they were wrong about you, you need to show them who you actually are, not how much money you have. Sarah was making sense, but there was still something in me that craved the dramatic moment, the perfect reversal, the look on their faces when they realized that their poor relationship was actually richer than all of them combined. But wouldn't the money prove both points? I asked. Wouldn't it show that they hurt someone who didn't deserve it and that they were wrong about my capabilities? It might. Or it might let them off the hook by making this about a lucky investment, rather than about their failure to see your worth as a person. Lucky investment. The phrase stung, because I knew that's exactly how they'd frame it. Not as evidence of my intelligence or foresight, or willingness to take calculated risks, but as dumb luck, a lottery ticket that happened to pay off. They'd find a way to diminish it, I realized. Probably, people usually do it when they need to protect their worldview from uncomfortable challenges. I pushed my salad around my plate, thinking. The fantasy of the big reveal was losing some of its appeal, but I still felt the pull of it. I still wanted that moment of vindication, that reversal of power, that dramatic shift in how they saw me. What if I split the difference? I said finally. What if I go to dinner Sunday and just be myself? Don't tell them about the money, but also don't let them lecture me about my choices. Set some boundaries. Stand up for the life I've built. Make it clear that I don't need their approval or their help. And then, if they can't respect that, if they keep pushing and condescending and treating me like a charity case, then maybe I'll tell them about the money. Not as proof that I'm successful, but as proof that their entire framework for judging people is broken. Sarah smiled, and this time it looked genuinely approving. Now that sounds strategic. Give them a chance to see you clearly without the money complicating things. And if they can't or won't, well, then you'll know where you stand. And if they can, if they actually listen and apologize and start treating me with respect, then you'll have to decide whether to tell them about the money anyway, or whether to keep that as your private victory. Elation. I think I want to try it your way first, I said. Go in there as myself, set some boundaries, see how they react. Save the nuclear option for if they can't handle basic human decency. The nuclear option being $50 million. The nuclear option being $50 million, I confirmed. Sarah raised her water glass. To strategic thinking and private victories. And to have friends who give good advice, I added, clinking my glass against hers. As we walked back to the office, I felt something shift inside me. The angry, reactive energy that had been driving me since Sunday night was settling into something calmer but more determined. I didn't need to prove anything to my family. I just needed to stop letting them treat me like I was less than I was. And if they couldn't handle that, well then I had 47 million reasons why their opinion didn't matter. Sunday was 3 days away. 3 days to prepare for a conversation that would either repair these relationships or end them entirely. 3 days to decide who I wanted to be in that room, the secretly wealthy family member getting revenge, or the person I'd always been finally demanding the respect I'd always deserved. Either way, I was done being small in a world that only seemed to value size. It was time to find out who my family really was when the comfortable assumptions were stripped away. Sunday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of New England weather that made everything look somber and serious. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, choosing my outfit with the same care a general might select armor before battle. Not my usual thrift store finds, but not designer either. The navy dress I'd bought for job interviews, paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. Professional but not pretentious. Confident but not flashy. I looked exactly like what I was. A successful marketing professional who knew her worth and didn't need external validation to prove it. The drive to Uncle Richard's house felt different this time. Instead of dreading each mile, I found myself getting calmer, more focused. Sarah's advice echoed in my mind. Be strategic. Know your goals. Give them a chance to see me clearly before deploying the nuclear option. The circular driveway looked the same as always, Mercedes and BMW gleaming despite the drizzle. But this time, as I parked my Honda Civic between David's Audi and Jessica's Lexus, I didn't feel the familiar pang of inadequacy. My car wasn't a symbol of failure, it was a choice. A practical, reliable choice made by someone who prioritized substance over appearance. Uncle Richard answered the door himself this time, his smile carefully calibrated to convey warmth without acknowledging any awkwardness from our last encounter. Vanessa, sweetheart, so glad you could make it. Come in, come in. The house still smelled like money. Leather and expensive candles, and whatever cleaning products rich people use to make marble floors gleam. But now I noticed other details. The way the furniture, while expensive, was clearly several years old. The artwork that looked impressive from a distance but bore the telltale signs of high-quality reproductions rather than originals. The careful staging that spoke of comfort rather than true wealth. They were successful, certainly. Well off by any reasonable standard. But they weren't rich? Not really. Not in the way that mattered when you were talking about generational wealth. About the kind of money that changed everything. Everyone's in the living room, Uncle Richard said, guiding me toward voices and the soft clink of ice against glass. Catherine made your favorite, that spinach and artichoke dip you always liked. My favorite. I'd mentioned liking it once, maybe 3 years ago, and somehow that had become part of the family mythology about me. As if I was simple enough to be defined by a single preference, predictable enough to be pleased by a single gesture. The living room was exactly as I'd left it the week before. Expensive, but not quite as expensive as it wanted to appear. Marcus sat in the leather armchair that had been his grandfather's, already nursing what looked like his second scotch of the afternoon. Jessica perched on the sofa next to David, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Aunt Catherine bustled around with a tray of appetizers, playing the perfect hostess. Vanessa! Aunt Catherine's voice carried that same forced sheer as always. You look lovely. That dress is so practical. Practical. Even her compliments were backhanded, managing to praise and diminish in the same breath. Thank you, I said simply, settling into the remaining chair. It's good to see everyone. How was your week? Uncle Richard asked, taking his position as family patriarch seriously. Work going well? Very well, actually. We just landed a major client that I've been pursuing for months. A tech startup that's preparing for their Series B funding round. It was true. Patterson and Associates had indeed signed a significant new client, and I had been the lead on the pitch. But I'd never talked about work in detail at these gatherings before, never positioned myself as anything more than a grateful employee showing up to do her job. That's wonderful, Uncle Richard said, though I could see him processing this slightly different version of me. What kind of tech startup? Fintech. They're developing blockchain-based solutions for cross-border payments. Very cutting-edge stuff. I watched their faces carefully as I mentioned blockchain. Marcus's eyebrows raised slightly. He'd clearly heard the term, but wasn't entirely sure what it meant. Jessica looked politely blank. David nodded, like he knew what I was talking about, but I could tell from his expression that his knowledge was surface level at best. Blockchain, Aunt Catherine repeated slowly. Isn't that Bitcoin? Blockchain is the underlying technology, I explained patiently. Bitcoin is just one application of it. There are thousands of different cryptocurrencies and blockchain projects now, each solving different problems in finance, supply chain management, data verification. I trailed off, realizing I was lecturing them about a topic they'd never bothered to understand, despite having opinions about my financial choices for years. It sounds very complicated, Jessica said with the tone doctors use when explaining procedures to patients who wouldn't understand the technical details. It can be, but once you understand the fundamentals, it's actually quite elegant. The whole point is removing intermediaries, banks, governments, corporations, and allowing people to transact directly with each other. But surely you need some kind of regulation, Uncle Richard said, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Some oversight to prevent fraud and manipulation. Traditional regulation, maybe not, but the technology itself provides transparency and security in ways that traditional systems can't match. Every transaction is recorded on a public ledger that can't be altered or deleted. I was enjoying this more than I'd expected. For the first time in our family history, I was the one with expertise they lacked, the one explaining concepts they didn't understand. The power dynamic had shifted without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. Well, Marcus said, clearly wanting to redirect the conversation. It's nice that you're learning about new industries through your work. That kind of exposure could be valuable if you ever decide to move into a more lucrative field. There it was. The assumption that my current work was just preparation for something better, something more worthy of their respect. Actually, I said carefully, I'm quite happy with my current field. We work with innovative companies that are literally changing the world. I find that more fulfilling than just chasing higher salaries. Fulfillment is important, Aunt Catherine agreed quickly, but so is security. You can't pay rent with fulfillment. I pay my rent just fine, I said, my voice still calm, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. I have for years. Of course you do, Uncle Richard said soothingly. We're not saying you don't. We're just saying that someone with your intelligence and education could probably do even better. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. They couldn't quite bring themselves to say I was unsuccessful, but they couldn't resist implying that I was underachieving. Better how? I asked directly. Well, Marcus jumped in. Higher salary, better benefits, more prestige. The kind of career that would give you real financial independence. I am financially independent, I said quietly. Are you? David asked, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. Because financial independence means different things to different people. Some people think having enough money to cover basic expenses is independence. Others understand that true independence means building wealth, having investments, being able to weather economic downturns without worry. Investments, building wealth, weathering economic downturns. If only they knew. What makes you think I don't have investments? I asked. The question seemed to catch them off guard. They exchanged glances, probably remembering the times I'd asked for small loans or mentioned being tight on money. Do you? Jessica asked directly. I looked around the room at their expectant faces, these people who'd spent years assuming they knew everything about my financial situation based on my job title and my car and my apartment size. Who'd built an entire narrative about my life without ever asking me directly about the choices I'd made or the plans I was executing. "Yes," I said simply. "I do." "What kind of investments?" Marcus pressed, clearly expecting me to mention a modest 401k or maybe a small savings account. This was it, the moment I'd been building toward all week. I could stick to Sarah's plan, set boundaries, demand respect, see if they were capable of treating me well based on who I was rather than what I owned. Or I could deploy the nuclear option right now, watch their assumptions crumble in real time. "The kind that have performed very well recently," I said, choosing the middle path. "Particularly in emerging technologies." "Emerging technologies," Uncle Richard repeated. "You mean like tech stocks?" "Among other things." "How well is it?" David asked, his finance background making him naturally curious about specifics. I pulled out my phone, opened the crypto app, and stared at the screen for a moment. The numbers had actually grown since I'd last checked. My portfolio was now worth just over $51 million. $51 million. More than all of their net worths combined. More than Uncle Richard's law firm. More than Marcus would make in 20 years at his current salary. More than Jessica would earn in her entire medical career. Fives. I could show them right now. I could watch their faces as they realized that the poor relation they'd been pitying for years was actually the wealthiest person they'd ever met. But something in their expressions stopped me. Not curiosity about my success, but the kind of predatory interest that comes when people smell money they might be able to access. David was leaning forward. Marcus had set down his drink. Even Aunt Catherine had stopped fussing with the appetizers. Sasazo iki alai, they didn't want to celebrate my success. They wanted to evaluate it, to figure out if it was real, to determine whether it changed my usefulness to them. "Well enough that I'm comfortable," I said finally, closing the phone without showing them the screen. "Comfortable," Marcus repeated, clearly unsatisfied with the vague answer. But comfortable could mean anything. Are we talking about enough for a down payment on a house? Or enough to pay off your student loans? Or I'm talking about enough that I don't need financial advice from people who assume I'm failing just because I make different choices than they do. The room went quiet. It wasn't the explosive confrontation I'd been imagining, but it was a line drawn in the sand. A clear statement that their assumptions about me were not only wrong but unwelcome. "Vanessa," Uncle Richard said carefully, "I don't think anyone here assumes you're failing." "Really?" I looked around the room. "Because last week Marcus called me poor. Jessica questioned whether I belonged anywhere. You offered to help me get into a quote, career because you thought I was afraid of making actual money. Aunt Catherine made comments about my simpler life like it was a consolation prize. They had the decency to look uncomfortable. Aunt Catherine busied herself rearranging already perfectly arranged flowers. David studied his drink like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Maybe," Jessica said slowly, "we made some assumptions that weren't fair." "Maybe?" I raised an eyebrow. "You spent an entire dinner discussing my financial situation like I wasn't in the room. You analyzed my choices, my potential, my worth as a person, based on external markers that don't actually tell you anything about my life." "We care about you," Marcus said, but he sounded defensive now. "We want you to succeed." "I have succeeded," I said firmly, "just not in ways you recognize or value. I've built a career I love, working with clients who respect my expertise. I've created financial security for myself through careful planning and smart investments. I've maintained my integrity and my values while building something meaningful." "But," David started. "But what?" I cut him off. "But I don't drive a luxury car? But I don't live in a house that impresses people at dinner parties? But I choose to spend my money on experiences and savings rather than status symbols?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. I could see them processing this different version of me, this person who pushed back instead of absorbing their criticism quietly. "You're right," Uncle Richard said finally. "We made assumptions. and maybe some of those assumptions were unfair. It was a start. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. A crack in the foundation of their certainty about who I was, and what my life meant. "I don't need your pity," I continued. "I don't need your concern about my choices. And I don't need your help building the life I want. What I need is for you to respect that I'm an adult who's capable of making good decisions, even if those decisions don't match your definition of success." "Of course," Aunt Catherine said quickly. "Of course we respect that." But even as she said it, I could see the skepticism in her eyes. The part of her that still believed I was deluding myself, that I was putting a brave face on a life that wasn't quite working out the way I'd planned. "Do you?" I asked quietly. "Because respect means trusting my judgment about my own life. It means assuming I know what I'm doing unless I specifically ask for advice. It means treating me like an equal member of this family instead of a charity case who needs your guidance." The words hung in the air like a challenge. This was their chance to prove they could see me differently, could treat me as the successful adult I'd always been instead of the struggling young person they'd decided I was. "You're absolutely right," Uncle Richard said, "and I thought maybe we were making progress. We should have been more supportive, less directive." "Thank you," I said, feeling some of the tension in my shoulders ease. "But," Marcus added, and I knew immediately that the progress was about to evaporate, "you have to admit that from the outside, it looked like you were struggling. I mean, you asked Dad for money last year. And there it was. The reason they'd never really see me differently, never really respect my choices. Because in their minds, anyone who ever needed help was permanently marked as unsuccessful. Permanently relegated to the category of people who required their guidance and pity. I asked for a $300 loan to cover a rent increase," I said evenly, "which I paid back within a month. Does that really define my entire financial situation in your mind?" "It's not just that," Jessica said. "It's the pattern. The old car, the small apartment, the job that doesn't pay very well." "The job that I excel at," I corrected. "The apartment that meets my needs perfectly. The car that's reliable and paid off." "But don't you want more?" Aunt Catherine asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. "Don't you want the security of knowing you could handle any emergency? Don't you want to be able to afford nice things without worrying about the cost?" And suddenly I realized that this wasn't really about money at all, it was about fear. They were afraid for me. Afraid that I was living too close to the edge. Too vulnerable to disaster. They genuinely believed they were protecting me by pushing me toward their version of security. But they were also afraid of me. Afraid of what it meant if someone could be happy and successful without following their prescribed path. Afraid of what it said about their own choices if mine turned out to be equally valid. "Toss. I want to be happy," I said finally. "I want to do work that matters to me. I want relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. And I want financial security on my own terms, not based on other people's definitions of what security looks like." "And you have all that?" David asked, genuine curiosity in his voice for the first time. I looked around the room at their faces, some skeptical, some concerned, some genuinely trying to understand. These people who'd raised me, celebrated my birthdays, shared holidays, and family traditions, and decades of history. Who'd also spent years making me feel small without meaning to, judging me by standards I'd never agreed to accept. "Yes," I said quietly. "I do have all that." "Even the financial security?" Marcus pressed. I picked up my phone again, stared at the screen showing $51 million, and made my choice. "Especially the financial security," I said, and turned the screen toward them. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just quiet, but the kind of profound stillness that comes when the fundamental assumptions underlying reality suddenly shift. I watched their eyes move across the numbers, watched them blink and refocus and blink again, watched the mathematics of my net worth slowly penetrate their understanding. "Is this real?" Uncle Richard whispered. "It's real. $51 million, Jessica said slowly, as if testing whether the words made sense when spoken aloud. "Give or take a few $100,000, depending on market fluctuations." Marcus was the first to find his voice. "How?" "Cryptocurrency. Primarily chain-link tokens that I bought 3 years ago for 37 cents each. They're trading at just over $60 now." You've been a millionaire this whole time? Aunt Catherine asked, her voice higher than usual. I've been a multi-millionaire for about 6 months. I just didn't know about it until last Sunday night, when I checked my portfolio for the first time in ages. The irony landed like a physical blow. While they'd been lecturing me about financial responsibility, I'd been sitting on enough money to buy and sell their entire social circle. Jesus Christ, David breathed. You're richer than all of us combined. Yes, I said simply, I am. And for the first time in my adult life, my family was completely, utterly speechless. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. I watched their faces cycle through emotions like a time-lapse of grief, denial, shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like fear. Uncle Richard was the first to recover, clearing his throat and straightening in his chair like he was preparing to deliver closing arguments. Vanessa, this is incredible. Congratulations. But his voice sounded hollow, automated, like he was reading from a script he'd never rehearsed. The word congratulations fell flat in the room, landing with all the enthusiasm of a funeral eulogy. Thank you, I said, sliding my phone back into my purse. Though I have to say, it's interesting to hear congratulations now, when you've been telling me I was failing for years. Marcus finally closed his mouth, which had been hanging open since he'd processed the numbers. But Vanessa, this changes everything. You could buy a house. You could invest in real estate, start a business, join the country club. Even faced with evidence that I was exponentially wealthier than any of them, his first instinct was to tell me how to spend my money, to assume I'd want to join their world now that I could afford it. I could, I agreed. But why would I want to? The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. Because you can afford it now. Because you don't have to live like... He gestured vaguely, searching for words that wouldn't sound insulting. Like what, Marcus? Like someone who chooses substance over status? Like someone who's happy with her life as it is? But you're rich now, Jessica said, as if this explained everything. You're actually rich. You don't have to pretend anymore. Pretend. The word hit like a slap. Even now, even faced with proof that I'd been more successful than any of them had imagined possible, they couldn't conceive that my choices had been genuine, rather than born of necessity. I wasn't pretending, I said carefully. I was living according to my values that apparently don't change just because my bank account did. But surely you'll make some changes, Aunt Catherine said, leaning forward with the kind of intense interest she usually reserved for gossip about the neighbors. I mean, you could move out of that tiny apartment, get a proper car. My apartment isn't tiny, it's efficient. And my car isn't improper, it's practical. But Vanessa, Uncle Richard said, his lawyer instincts kicking in, you need to think about security now. About protecting your assets. Someone with your level of wealth needs professional management, proper investment strategies. I almost laughed. Here they were, the same people who'd been questioning my financial judgment an hour ago, now eager to advise me on wealth management. I have a financial advisor, I said, which was true. I'd spent Thursday afternoon interviewing candidates and had signed with Morrison Capital Management, a firm that specialized in cryptocurrency wealth. And a tax attorney. And a very comprehensive security plan. You do? David asked, surprise evident in his voice. Of course I do. Did you think I'd stumble onto $50 million and just leave it sitting in an app on my phone? Actually, that was exactly what they'd thought. I could see it in their faces. The assumption that I was naive, unprepared, in need of their guidance to navigate wealth properly. It's just, Jessica said carefully, this is all very sudden. A week ago you were asking about student loan refinancing options, and now... A week ago I was being responsible about my debt management, while my investments grew in the background. The fact that you didn't know about my financial situation doesn't mean it was sudden or accidental. But why didn't you tell us? Aunt Catherine asked, and there was genuine hurt in her voice. We're family. We should have known. The question was so absurd that I almost choked on my water. Tell you what, exactly? That I'd made some speculative investments that might pay off someday? That I was quietly building wealth while you were all lecturing me about my poor choices? Yes, Marcus said emphatically. We could have helped you manage it better. Could have given you advice. Based on what expertise? I asked. Your Harvard MBA that taught you about traditional finance, but apparently skipped the unit on emerging technologies? Uncle Richard's law practice that deals with estate planning for people with conventional portfolios? David's entry-level position at Goldman Sachs where he analyzes public companies that are 5 years behind the curve on blockchain adoption? The room went quiet again. I was being harsh, I knew that, but something in me had snapped. For years I'd absorbed their condescension, their assumptions about my incompetence, their certainty that they knew better than I did about everything. I didn't tell you, I continued, because I knew this would happen. I knew you'd assume I was lucky rather than smart. I knew you'd want to manage my money instead of respecting my judgment. I knew you'd find ways to make this about your expertise, rather than acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, I knew what I was doing all along. That's not fair, Uncle Richard said. We're just concerned. About what? About my ability to handle wealth responsibly? The same way you were concerned about my ability to handle poverty responsibly? The parallel landed hard. They'd questioned my judgment when I was broke, and they were questioning my judgment now that I was rich. The common denominator wasn't my financial situation. It was their inability to see me as a competent adult capable of making good decisions. We've made mistakes, Jessica admitted quietly. Obviously, we misunderstood your situation. But we care about you, Vanessa. We want what's best for you. What you want, I said, is for me to be successful in ways that make sense to you. You want me to use my money to buy the same things you value, to join the same clubs, to validate the choices you've made. But that's not what's best for me. Then what is best for you? David asked, and for the first time he sounded genuinely curious rather than judgmental. I looked around the room at these people who'd shaped my childhood, who'd celebrated my high school graduation and sent care packages during college, who'd also spent the last decade making me feel like a disappointment at every family gathering. What's best for me is continuing to live according to my values, I said. Doing work that matters to me, maintaining relationships based on mutual respect, using my resources in ways that align with my principles. The spring sunshine streamed through the windows of my new home office as I finished reviewing the quarterly report for the Henderson Foundation. Yes, I'd kept the family name, partly as a reminder of where I'd come from, partly because it felt right to honor the complicated legacy of people who'd shaped me even when they'd misunderstood me. The foundation focused on financial literacy education and cryptocurrency accessibility for underserved communities. We'd already funded 12 programs across New England, teaching people like my former self how to understand and navigate emerging financial technologies. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using my crypto fortune to help others discover the same opportunities my family had dismissed as fake internet money. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Sarah Chen's name appeared on the screen. Vanessa, how's retirement treating you? She asked with a laugh. It's not retirement, it's just different work. I'd left Patterson and Associates 3 months ago, not because I had to, but because I'd found something I wanted to do more. How are things at the office? Busy. We miss your creative eye, but I'm proud of you for following your passion. Speaking of which, how's the book coming? The book. Blockchain for Humans. Understanding the technology that's changing everything. 3 publishers had made offers after reading my proposal, but I'd chosen the smaller press that understood my vision for making complex financial concepts accessible to ordinary people. First draft is done. My editor thinks it could actually help people understand what they're investing in instead of just following the hype. That's amazing. And the family? How are things there? I glanced at the framed photo on my desk, last month's Easter dinner at my new house. A house I'd bought not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I'd wanted space for a proper office and a garden. Uncle Richard and Aunt Catherine sat at one end of the table, Marcus and his new girlfriend at the other. Jessica had brought her fiancé, and David had surprised everyone by bringing his boyfriend, something he'd apparently been nervous about revealing to the family for years. Better, I said honestly. Different, but better. The transition hadn't been smooth. There had been awkward months of recalibrated relationships, of them learning to see me as an equal rather than a charity case, of me learning to trust that their newfound respect wasn't just about my bank account. Marcus had been the most surprising. 3 weeks after the revelation dinner, he'd called to ask if I wanted to grab coffee, not to talk about money or investments or what I should do with my fortune, but to apologize, really apologize. Now, I've been thinking about what you said, he'd told me over lattes at a small cafe near his office, about how we treated you. And I realized that we weren't just wrong about your financial situation. We were wrong about who you are as a person. What do you mean? I mean, you were always the smartest one in the room. You were always asking different questions, seeing things from angles the rest of us missed. But instead of listening to you, we dismissed you because you didn't fit our definition of success. He'd paused, stirring his coffee unnecessarily. I think we were threatened by you, honestly. By the fact that you seemed happy with choices we couldn't understand. It was easier to assume you were struggling than to consider that maybe our way wasn't the only right way. That conversation had changed things between us. Not overnight, but gradually. Marcus started asking about my work with genuine curiosity rather than condescension. He'd even attended one of my financial literacy workshops, sitting in the back row taking notes like any other student. Jessica had taken longer to come around. The surgeon in her was used to being the expert, the one with specialized knowledge that others couldn't understand. But eventually, she'd admitted that she'd learned more about investing from my foundation's materials than from all her financial advisor meetings combined. You explain things in a way that makes sense, she'd told me at Christmas. You don't use jargon to make yourself sound smart. You actually want people to understand. Even Uncle Richard had evolved. The crisis at his law firm that had interrupted our revelation dinner had turned out to be more serious than he'd initially admitted. He was losing clients to younger, more tech-savvy firms that understood the legal implications of blockchain technology and digital assets. Would you be willing to consult for us? He'd asked hesitantly during a family barbecue in July. Help us understand how cryptocurrency affects estate planning, business formation, that kind of thing. I'd agreed, not because I needed the work, but because it felt like a full-circle moment. The family member they'd once pitied for her poor career choices was now the expert they needed to stay relevant in a changing world. Vanessa? Sarah's voice brought me back to the present. You still there? Sorry, just thinking. You asked about the family. They're learning. We all are. Learning what? Learning that success isn't a competition. Learning that different people can build meaningful lives in different ways. Learning that money changes things, but it doesn't change everything. After we hung up, I walked to the window of my home office and looked out at the garden I'd planted behind the house. Not because wealthy people were supposed to have gardens, but because I'd always loved growing things and finally had the space to do it properly. The house itself was modest by rich person standards. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, nothing that would look out of place in an upper-middle-class neighborhood. But it was perfect for me. Large enough for hosting family dinners when I wanted to, small enough that I didn't feel lost in it, practical enough that I could maintain it myself, beautiful enough that it felt like home. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Saw the TechCrunch article about your foundation. Proud of you for using your platform to actually help people instead of just buying more stuff you don't need, the TechCrunch article. That had been an unexpected development. Apparently, a foundation started by a cryptocurrency millionaire was newsworthy, especially when that millionaire was focused on education rather than self-promotion. The interview had been surreal. Sitting across from a journalist who was fascinated by the fact that I still drove my Honda Civic and lived modestly, despite being worth over $60 million now. Most crypto millionaires we interview are eager to show off their Lamborghinis and mansions, the reporter had said. Why are you different? Because the money isn't the point, I'd answered. Money is a tool. The point is what you build with it. What I'd built was a life that felt authentic to me. A foundation that was making a real difference in people's financial literacy. A book that might help others understand the technology that had changed my life. Relationships with my family that were based on mutual respect, rather than obligation and pity. And yes, I'd made some changes. I'd bought the house not to impress anyone, but because I'd wanted space and privacy. I'd hired a housekeeper, Not because I thought I was too good to clean, but because I'd rather spend my time writing and working on the foundation. I'd upgraded my phone to one with an uncracked screen, though I'd kept the same phone number. But I'd also kept my old apartment, turning it into a small office space for foundation meetings. I'd kept my Honda Civic, though I'd finally gotten the air conditioning fixed. I'd kept my values, my priorities, my sense of who I was and what mattered to me. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflection. Through the window, I saw David's car in the driveway. He'd started stopping by on Sundays, ostensibly to check on me, but really because he seemed to enjoy our conversations about technology and the future of finance. "Hey," he said when I opened the door. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just reviewing foundation reports. Want some coffee?" We settled in the kitchen, a space I'd designed for conversation as much as cooking. David looked different than he had 6 months ago, more relaxed, less concerned with maintaining the perfect image of success. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week," he said, "about alternative investments." Last week, he'd asked me about diversifying beyond traditional stock and bond portfolios. Not because he wanted to get rich quick, but because he'd realized that his entire understanding of investing had been shaped by institutional thinking that might not be serving his actual goals. And I've been doing research, not just on cryptocurrency, but on the whole philosophy behind it. This idea of decentralization, of removing intermediaries, of giving people more control over their own financial destinies. I smiled. "What did you find?" "That you were right 3 years ago when you started buying Link. That the technology really is revolutionary. But more than that, I found that I've been thinking about money all wrong." "How so?" "I've been focused on accumulation instead of purpose. On having enough money to buy things, instead of having enough money to choose how I spend my time and energy." It was the same realization I'd had, sitting in that gas station parking lot 6 months ago. The understanding that wealth wasn't about stuff, it was about freedom. "So what are you going to do with that insight?" "I'm thinking about leaving Goldman Sachs," he said quietly. "Starting my own practice, focusing on helping people understand alternative investments and non-traditional financial planning." "That's a big change." "It is. But watching what you've done with your fortune, seeing how you've used it to create something meaningful rather than just accumulating more wealth, it made me realize that I want to build something too." We talked for another hour about his plans, about the foundation's latest projects, about the crypto market's evolution and what it meant for ordinary investors. It was the kind of conversation I'd never had with family members before, substantive, respectful, built on mutual curiosity, rather than one person explaining to another how they should live their life. As David was leaving, he paused at the door. "Vanessa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret it? Not telling us sooner about the money?" I thought about the question. Did I regret keeping the secret for those crucial months when I'd been building my strategy, working with financial advisors, figuring out who I wanted to be as a wealthy person? "No," I said finally. "I think I needed that time to figure out who I was with money before I found out who you all were when you knew I had it." "And who were we?" "You were people who needed to learn the same lesson I did. That money doesn't change who you are fundamentally, but it reveals who you've been all along." After David left, I spent the evening working on my book, writing about the psychology of financial decision-making and the ways that technology was democratizing access to wealth-building tools. But mostly, I was thinking about identity and transformation, and the strange ways that life can shift everything while changing nothing. I was still the same person who'd walked into that family dinner 6 months ago, the one who'd driven home humiliated and heartbroken. I still cared about meaningful work, authentic relationships, and using whatever resources I had to make a positive impact. I still preferred substance over status, experiences over possessions, growth over comfort. But I was also different in ways that had nothing to do with the money. I was more confident, not because I was wealthy, but because I'd learned to trust my own judgment, even when other people questioned it. I was more selective about relationships, not because I was arrogant, but because I'd realized that life was too short to spend time with people who couldn't see my value. I was more purposeful about my choices, not because I could afford anything I wanted, but because I had learned that having unlimited options required more intentionality, not less. The crypto fortune had been a catalyst, but it wasn't the real story. The real story was about a woman who'd spent years allowing other people to define her worth, who'd finally found the courage to define it herself. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I passed the framed photo from Easter dinner again. My family gathered around a table in a house I owned, eating food I'd prepared, celebrating a holiday that brought us together despite our differences and misunderstandings and years of complicated history. They looked happy in the photo. Not because I was rich, though that had certainly changed the dynamics between us, but because we'd finally learned to see each other clearly, to respect each other's choices, to love each other without trying to change each other. Uncle Richard had been right that night 6 months ago when he'd said I'd taught them something about boundaries. But what I'd really taught them, what we'd all learned together, was that you can't love someone properly until you see them as they actually are, not as you need them to be. The poor cousin who'd become the richest family member hadn't changed. She'd just stopped hiding. And in a world that often measured worth by wealth, she'd proven that the most valuable thing you could own was the courage to be exactly who you were, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. That night, as I fell asleep in my comfortable house in my comfortable bed, I didn't dream about money or vindication or dramatic family confrontations. I dreamed about the workshop I was teaching next week, about the book I was writing, about the foundation's next project. I dreamed about the life I was building, one authentic choice at a time, with or without anyone else's approval. And for the first time in years, I slept the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who finally knew exactly who she was. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.